Hello, welcome and good evening. Welcome to the August 2021 online meeting of Sydney Skeptics in the Pub. It's not quite a pub, but we're doing the best we can. My name is Richard Saunders, from the Australian Skeptics here in Sydney and host and producer of the Skeptic Zone podcast. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting tonight. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Don't forget, you can subscribe to The Skeptic, the journal from Australian Skeptics, that fine magazine, this year celebrating 40 years in print. In fact, you can access almost all the back issues of this magazine free by visiting www.skeptics.com.au. And there is a wealth of information there. You can imagine 40 years of reports, interviews, book reviews, investigations, excuse me, all sorts of things. And put Thursday, the 2nd of February in your diary for no particular reason, but also put Thursday, the 2nd of September next month in your diary for the next Skeptics in the Pub online, and keep an eye out on our meetup page for more information. And that's meetup.com. And then you just search for Aust Skeptics, AUST Skeptics. Now, this year, the Australian and New Zealand Skeptics are holding a joint national convention or national conference. And that will be on the 20th and the 21st of November. More details about speakers and times and things will be coming soon. And we are sizing up the current situation here in Sydney, at least, with COVID, owing to the recent outbreak, and we'll be amending and altering what we do depending on what that situation is in November. You can register your interest for our convention, our joint convention, by visiting www.skepticon.org.au. Again, if you go to skeptics.com.au, there is a handy link there to follow. Now let's talk about tonight. Tonight, what a thrill it is to have an old mate of mine talk to us. I've known this character for many, many years. We've had some fine skeptical adventures along the way and a few boozy nights, I can promise you. Adjunct Associate Professor Paul Willis. I remember him from the days when he used to carry around little dinosaurs. Tonight's talk is Beyond Atheist. Paul says that people have been drawn into a sucker punch when they identify as atheists. They are defining themselves with respect to the rejection of other people's paradigms and not defining themselves by their own positive values. Identifying as a secular rational humanist is a better descriptor of Paul. His beef is not with someone else's concept of a god or other supernatural beings. He rejects belief as a tool for reason and rational discussion. If you reject belief, then you can't even begin to argue for or against belief concepts such as gods. Reject belief and move beyond atheism. Paul is Adjunct Associate Professor in Paleontology, there's the dinosaurs again, at Flinders University, and a freelance teacher and researcher communication. He spent 6 years as the director of the Royal Institution of Australia in Adelaide and 14 years at the ABC as a science reporter and producer. He now has his own video production and research company, Palaeo Pictures, telling the world the stories from the history of life. You'll have an opportunity to ask questions of our guest, and you can do that via the link on the Twitch page you are looking at now. That will take you to a Slido page where you can put questions where I can see them on my other screen, and then later on we can get to those questions for Paul. And if you haven't done so already, please click the follow button so you'll be notified whenever we go live again. But for now, please join me in giving a big ancient prehistoric welcome to Adjunct Associate Professor Paul Willis.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction there, Richard. Indeed, our paths do go back into last millennium, and it's always been a pleasure to be associated, not just with Richard, but also with the Skeptics. I had the honour of being made Skeptic of the Year in 2002 because of my work against the creationists, and it's the highest honour that I think could be bestowed on any thinking Australian. All right, let's dive into the slide deck. So if I do this and do that, are you seeing the slide deck? Yes or no? Hello?
Yes, Paul, everything's fine.
Okay, right. Phew, you had me worried there for a moment. Okay, I'll put it back up and off we go. One of the most common questions I get when I meet someone for the first time and they find out that I'm a paleontologist is, do you believe in God? And I find that a little odd. There's an implicit assumption that I may be the enemy, an unbeliever in their beliefs. I'd much rather they ask me questions about paleontology. Asking me about my belief in their gods sheds no real light on who I am or the values and ideas that make up my life. But it does reveal a lot about the questioners. Another reason why I find that the simple question troubling is not the bit about God, it's the bit about belief. My problem with belief is that it looks like a rather foolish way of investigating the world. Belief is not a reliable knowledge tool that can be used to create a useful worldview, nor is it a particularly useful way to gather and evaluate knowledge. I can neither accept or reject a God because I have no way that I can evaluate that concept. I reject belief as a mechanism, so I can't begin to evaluate the belief concept of a God. This is why I think we're drawn into a sucker punch when we identify as atheists. We are defining ourselves by the rejection of other people's ideas rather than defining ourselves by our own set of values. It's a bit like a Henry Moore sculpture, defined by the space surrounding it rather than the sculpture itself. To define myself as an atheist only suggests that I reject someone else's ideas. Just to think about that for a second, why identify yourself by what you reject? Hopefully, no one here will be surprised to know that I reject paedophilia and fascism. I do not identify as a Rastafarian, nor as an aardvark. So what possible benefit could there be of me going around telling everybody that I'm not a paedophilic Rastafarian Nazi aardvark? Makes no sense. Catholics don't identify as not Protestants. Christians don't identify as non-Muslims. And Hindus don't define themselves by their rejection of the pantheon of Nordic gods pissing and fighting their way through their eternity in Valhalla. How does it help anyone to understand me if I define myself by not accepting someone else's god or gods? What's my beef with belief? As I understand it, belief is to accept a proposition without evidence. As soon as you have evidence to support a proposition, it ceases to be a belief. At this point of writing this particular talk, I thought it prudent to finally do some research into a definition of belief. And according to Google, belief is an acceptance of something that exists or is true, especially one without proof. I do wish I hadn't gone there. This definition raises more problems for me than it solves. Talk about truth and proof to a Popperian like me is so much bullshit. But I think that the underlying proposition is congruent. Belief is not about evidence. In fact, belief can only thrive in the absence of evidence. So that's where my beef with belief begins. As a rationalist, I muster evidence and follow that path to its logical conclusion. How can a knowledge path exist if there's no evidence to pave the way? That concept is unfathomable to me. It's been pointed out to me that there are various followers of various faiths that claim to have evidence that supports their beliefs, but so far the pieces of evidence they've provided do not pass muster of a rational evaluation. Feeling the presence of God is not reasonable evidence. Claims of prayers being answered or miraculous interventions never survive objective scrutiny. The phenomena of speaking in tongues is not evidence of the divine, but it is an excellent example of self-delusion. There's also an internal problem with belief, in that without some yardstick for evaluation, how can you establish which beliefs are worthy of consideration and which are not? Bereft of the scales of reason upon which to weigh and measure statements of belief, how can a believer accept one belief and reject another? For example, how can you accept that Jesus was the Son of God born of a virgin, while at the same time rejecting that the elephant-headed god Ganesha was born as the son of Hindu gods Shiva and Parvati? Both claims have zero evidence to support them, and they can only be held as acts of faith or belief. And if you carry this thought through to its logical conclusion, you are left with only two choices: accept all belief claims, even if they're contradictory, or reject all propositions because they cannot verify any one of them. As a tool for gaining knowledge, belief is useless. I'm not an atheist because I reject your God. I'm rejecting belief. I can't even get to the stage where I can form the concept of God to reject. There's another reason why I don't like to be identified as an atheist. Unfortunately, declaring as an atheist is seen by some believers as an invitation to engage in a discussion about their particular favourite fantasies. Declare your atheism and every Bible-thumping, brainless evangelical fuckwit comes crawling out of the woodwork, intent on telling me about all the glories of God and the everlasting love of Jesus fucking Christ. They all want to impress on me how their delusions are true and how I should follow their footsteps towards salvation. And I'm really not interested in doing that. If I reject belief, and that is the foundation of their worldview, there is nothing constructive I can offer in that discussion. I really have no interest in whatever they might have to say, let alone exploring what truths they think are hidden within their beliefs. Why waste my time discussing their fantasies? I also don't want to get into those discussions because it's doubly disrespectful. It disrespects their belief, but it also is disrespectful of my desire not to engage with them. Let's face it, if you strip away the reverence afforded to religious propositions by the faith of the believer, most religious propositions are just plain nutty. I can only assume that the more intelligent, rational believers that I've come across recognize this, and their only hope of maintaining their faith is not to step back and rationally evaluate their beliefs. There are plenty of cases where that has happened, and the boldly enlightened of them reject their faith. And I'm also not so naive as to ignore the numerous examples of intelligent and rational non-believers who have been converted into a religion. I just don't know how they clear the logic barrier. How can I handle a sensible, respectful conversation about a bunch of ideas that simply look silly to me? If you do force me into a conversation about your faith, I can't get past your faith's absurdities. You may well find that disrespectful, so don't ask me to go there. So, who am I? I'm a secular, rational humanist. Let's take those propositions one by one. I'm a secularist. I accept that we live in a society where there are many different faiths and beliefs, as well as the complete absence of faith and belief. And that the way we need to live together is in peace and harmony. I should declare here that I am actually an ambassador for the Australian National Secular Lobby, a body set up to counterbalance the influences of groups such as the Australian Christian Lobby, who seek to influence national policies in favour of their beliefs. With a growing percentage of Australians identifying as having no religion, surely our interests must be fairly represented in the public square. Here's another visualization of that data. Religious identities within the federal cabinet versus the Australian population. It shows a disturbing overrepresentation of Christians and Jews in the federal cabinet and a drastic underrepresentation of atheists and non-religious Australians. While the strict definition is something like the state of being unrelated or neutral in regard to religion, I view secularism as a mechanism whereby people of different faiths can live side by side without killing each other. In what may seem to many to be a perversion of the concept, secularism actually enshrines religious freedom for all, including freedom from religion. From that perspective, I'm perplexed at people of faith who portray secularism as the godless enemy, a non-religious state which threatens their religious freedoms. This misconception must be challenged because it's 180 degrees wrong. I find it baffling when people of faith do not also identify as secularists. Our secular society was set up as a secular state, as enshrined in the Constitution, and originally that was to protect Catholics from Protestants and vice versa. Now that secular freedom is extended to many faiths and religions. I do not understand why people of faith do not embrace secularism as the protector of their religious freedoms. The opposite of faith is not secularism, but the opposite of secularism is sectarianism. The idea of religious imperialism which sets faith against faith. Sectarianism cannot lead to a safe, cohesive, and peaceful society. When you think of sectarian societies, you think of people divided by faith and at war with each other. Think of the sectarian violence of Northern Ireland in the latter half of the 20th century, or the simmering sectarian violence between India and Pakistan, or the proxy sectarian wars between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We definitely do not want a secular society, so we cannot afford to reject a secular one. Did I say secular society? Let me read that again, make sure I got that in the right order. We definitely do not want a sectarian society, so we cannot afford to reject a secular one. Okay, I got it right that time. And just before we move along, hot off the press, here are the results of some market research commissioned by the National Secular Lobby and published today. In the upcoming census, people will be asked, what is your religion? And the NSL think that this is a leading question. So to demonstrate their point, they commissioned Essential Media to conduct two surveys. One asked, what is your religion, as stated in the census? And the other is, do you have a religion? Which is a non-leading form of the same question. They then followed up with respondents as to what that religion might be. The results are that with the question as stated in the census, only 41% of respondents identified as non-religious, whereas in the non-leading form of the question, 52% of respondents responded as not religious. Why does that matter? because the census are a way to collect data that is used to determine the distribution of funding for things like religious-based schools, health care, and aged care facilities. Businesses that are free to disperse funds back to their parent church, mosque, or synagogue. By misrepresenting the number of Australians who have no religion, this question disproportionately supports religious organisations. And don't even get me started on the fact that the census identifies atheism as an other religion. I wonder how the Lutherans and the Salvation Army feel about that. There's 3 simple rules to a secular society. The first is universal religious freedom, the freedom to follow whatever you like and to conduct your religious practices unhindered. In some ways, this is the most difficult of the 3 rules to follow if, like me, you see all religious beliefs as somewhat silly and some so absurd as to be fraudulent. But no one can pick and choose here. I want to acknowledge at this point and thank Chrissy Stevenson for providing me with some useful commentary on this talk. In particular, she directed me to the findings in the case of the Church of the New Faith of Scientology versus the Commissioner of Payroll Tax Victoria by the Australian Taxation Office in 1983, where the justices of the High Court made some astute and surprising comments of relevance here. In the eyes of the law, religions are equal. There is no religious club with a monopoly of state privileges for its members. The policy of the law is one in, all in. You can't point to Scientology and say that's not allowed because it's obviously an absurd creation of a failed science fiction writer. You can't disqualify the Pentecostals because their prosperity doctrine is blatantly anti-Christian and the whole church looks to be nothing more than a tax-dodging, money-making racket. And you can't exclude a church even if they've been shown to be committing crimes such as harbouring and protecting pedophiles within their own ranks. Universal religious freedom must be gifted to all religions without exception. One more from the Scientology versus the ATO, and the justices said much the same thing. Administrators and judges must resist the temptation to hold that groups or institutions are not religious because claimed religious beliefs or practices seem absurd, fraudulent, evil, or novel. Now, don't get me wrong. I would dearly love for there to be some mechanism where there is some regulation and registration of religious beliefs. I dream of a court of religious arbitration where the Scientologists could be struck off for being deluded, where the Pentecostals have to answer for their anti-Christian ways, and whole churches riddled with criminal activity are simply defrocked. I seethe at the more than 19,500 religious organisations that are registered as charities in Australia, giving them the benefit of avoiding tax. The thought that my taxes are effectively subsidising their fantasies makes me furious. But if you respect the secular rule of universal religious freedom, you can't implement any winnowing mechanism to sort out the wheat from the chaff. Besides, if such a mechanism did exist, I suspect it would reveal all chaff and no wheat. Besides, those wise justices of Scientology versus the ATO said as much again. Charlatanism is a necessary price of religious freedom. And if a self-proclaimed teacher persuades others to believe in a religion which he propounds, lack of sincerity or integrity on his part is not incompatible with the religious character of the beliefs, practices, or observances held by his followers. And I hope you're appalled as much of the sexism in that comment as you are by the implications on the conduct of religions. Sadly, through gritted teeth, I have to agree that there can be no exclusion of any religion in the rule of universal religious freedom as has to be observed. But without exclusion should not mean without scrutiny. All the activities within each and every religion and faith community ought to be open for inspection. The light of reason should be shone into every dark corner of faith, and the faithful ought to be able to justify and explain what they do and why they do it. Questioning the unquestionable should be mandatory. So let me propose a system of checks and balances to curb some of the excesses seen in some religious groups. While universal religious freedoms must be extended to all without exclusion, granting of tax-free status as a charity on religious grounds should be conditional. And the conditionals should be simple: that your books should be open for scrutiny, and if you are conducting businesses or any other activity that is not core religious in nature, your tax-deductible status should be revoked. You are still free to practice your religion, but I no longer have to subsidize the business that you are conducting in the name of your religion. Again, this is a little more complicated than I've just described, and this article, once again brought to my attention by the wonderful Chrissy Stevenson, goes into more detail as to what religions have to disclose and also what they do and do not have to disclose. The upshot being, religious organizations do receive tax-exempt status, and basic religious organizations do remain exempt from standard accounting and record-keeping obligations. We can't look into their books and see what they're doing. They could get away with murder. The second rule of secularism is that you must not impose your beliefs on others. This is something of an extension of the first rule, but also it's a check on it. If you truly respect religious freedoms for all, you must not impose your beliefs on others, nor should you have to tolerate others imposing their beliefs on you. This rule runs into trouble where sects or faiths endorse proselytizing, evangelizing, and public witnessing. While some particular sects might spring to mind here when I mention this, such as the evangelical Christian street preachers, it's also worth remembering that even within the Hindus, the Hare Krishnas are viewed as the fringe evangelical happy clappers of Hinduism, happy clappers for Vishnu. But this is a very simple rule to demarcate, with the adage, do unto others as you would have them do to you. If you don't want other faiths evangelizing to you, then clearly you should not be evangelizing to them. This rule also gets smashed when the separation of faith and state is not respected. When those in power allow their faiths and beliefs to influence public policy, that can only see division across society. Witness the unfolding debacle surrounding our current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, where the influence of his faith appears to seep through into policies of his government. Even more curious are examples where the actions of his government appear to run contrary to his publicly espoused beliefs. We're left gobsmacked at how Christian beliefs can be espoused on Sundays, while Monday through to Friday we see some utterly unchristian policies implemented, such as the total disregard for the poor, the near worship and veneration of the rich, the demonizing of foreigners, and the destruction of the environment. Yes, I've just described a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, where the beliefs of those in power may or may not feed into the framing of policy. But this only emphasizes the need to respect the separation of faith and state. I was disappointed when recently on Q&A there was some discussion about ScoMo's religious beliefs. Everybody took the safe ground of saying he's free to believe whatever he wants, and none of them expressed any unease with his particular faith. Yes, he is free to believe whatever he likes, but many Australians do have serious concerns about his particular faith. It simply looks shonky. It appears to be the ethically bankrupt and morally bankrupt. It appears to be ethically bankrupt and morally vacuous. More troubling is it appears to be blatantly anti-Christian in some of its articles of faith. It looks like the bastard child of American evangelism meets uber capitalism. It appears to be little more than a very lucrative money-making scam that can operate tax-free under the guise of being a religion. And many Australians are concerned about that the Prime Minister cannot see and avoid what appears to be such a dodgy scam suggests that he's unfit to be Prime Minister. That the Prime Minister wholeheartedly endorses such a dubious faith is doubly troubling. Yes, he has the right to follow the faith if that's what he truly wants to do. But particularly because we're talking about the leader of the nation here, we should have the right to critically examine his belief system and reject on any possible and reflect on any possible influence that it might have on his ability to do his job. And the third rule of secularism is do no harm. Do no harm to others within your faith, to yourself, and to others outside of your faith. This could also be written as obey the laws of the society that you are part of. Paedophilia, sexual assault, rape, or any other law that is broken within a faith community must be reported to the authorities and dealt with by the courts. State laws must always trump religious doctrine. That to me is a no-brainer, the thick end of the wedge of the do no harm rule. Where this becomes less clear-cut is where some religious practices come into conflict with state law. What do we do about circumcision? Is male circumcision acceptable but not female circumcision? Some sects indulge in self-flagellation and other acts of self-harm. Should that be allowed? If the seal of confession extends to concealing crime, should the state intervene? Now, I'm not equipped to adjudicate on these matters, not that my pontifications would mean anything anyway, but I do raise them here to emphasize the fact that the boundaries of the third rule can be very difficult to define. I'm a rationalist. I've built my understanding of the world around me through a process of examining the evidence before me and drawing logical conclusions around how that evidence fits together, how the world functions, and particularly in my case as a paleontologist, how it's operated in the past. Rationalism is evidence-based thinking, a knowledge system that attempts to understand the physical world around us. I cannot conceive of any knowledge system that proceeds without evidence. Facts are the bricks with which we build the walls of reason. We build models that we think explain how the facts converge to create the phenomena we observe in the world around us. It's impossible for me to entertain the idea that there can be any other knowledge building process outside of rationalism and evidence-based thinking. That's not to say that such systems don't exist. It's just beyond my powers of comprehension to understand how they operate. Belief systems are an excellent example. I'm not denying that they exist. I simply don't understand how they work, and I certainly don't think that they're useful systems for knowledge. And are there limits to my rational world? Yes, there are. Are there phenomena that cannot be explained by reason and examination of evidence? Most definitely. But just because we cannot rationally explain a particular phenomena today does not mean that we might be able to do so tomorrow. Perhaps there are phenomena that will never be explicable through rational inquiry, but I'm good with that. It's nice to have unknowable unknowns. In fact, I do find personal meaning beyond the limits of my rational world. For example, I don't know why I find beauty in a sunset or a flower or a smile from my son. Yes, I can understand the physics of light and how they make a glorious sunset. I understand the evolutionary history that has led to the creation of an attractive flower. And of course, I know the genetic bonds that draw me to my son's smile. But I don't know why I find them beautiful or glorious or attractive. What is beauty? What is that wonderfully warm inner glow that I feel when I'm observing beautiful things and that can't be measured by any thermometer? This is something beyond my rational powers to explain, and I'm quite happy about that. Of course, there may well be a huge body of research into perceptions of beauty. Sorry, forgot to change the slide there. Of course, there may be a huge body of research into perceptions of beauty, and someone may well have conducted all the rational inquiries into beauty to explain all of this to me in a rational way, but that's not the point. For me, this is a limit to my rational world, and I relish in its unknown. This is where rationalists can experience some sense of spirituality, those awe-inspiring feelings of something vast and otherwise unknown. One way to describe my spirituality is that which is beyond my rational experience. I can feel and experience sensations that I cannot rationally explain. I cannot weigh or measure. I cannot measure or weigh them with evidence, and those feelings must remain inexplicable as they are awesome. This is not an excuse to invoke a belief to fill that knowledge gap. If I'm inspired by and awestruck by the unknowable world around me, that moment should not be sullied by irrational invocations of gods, angels, or any other mythical non-existence. I'm a humanist. A common complaint from believers is that if you don't have a God to dictate moral values, how can you lead a moral life? The sad rejoinder to this is to wonder if a believer would still lead a moral life if they didn't have a mythical celestial cop hounding their ass. Humanism is understanding that moral values are human constructs. Humanism considers that humans are the starting point for all serious moral and philosophical inquiry. No gods need apply. While the term only entered the English language in the 19th century, the concept can be traced back to origins early in the Common Era or the late BCEs with the concept of humanitas, which means something of a synonym to philanthropy or expressions of kindness and benevolence towards one's fellow humans. Humanism has a long and somewhat convoluted history that can be traced through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and across several cultures. But it wasn't until the 1940s that the idea of humanism were consolidated thanks to the formation of the American Humanist Association. Included among their membership were the likes of Isaac Asimov, Kurt Vonnegut, and Gore Vidal, who actually became an honorary president. Humanism is currently recognized as a corollary of secularism and is often associated with atheism, agnosticism, and other non-beliefisms. What it offers to me is a logical and reasoned set of moral values that contribute to healthy, happy, and peaceful communities. There are no supernatural invocations of questionable moral decisions, and everything is up for review as our society evolves ever more complex ethical and moral dilemmas. To me, this is the real strength of humanism. It is dynamic and evolving, just like life itself, and not rigid and predetermined by unknown entities. So there you have it. I'm a secular, rational humanist. I think I've moved beyond atheism, and I can heartily recommend that journey. My life deserves to be more than a negation of someone else's beliefs. And I think you deserve that freedom as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Associate Adjunct Professor Dr. Herr Paul Willis, and all the titles I can possibly give you. We had this conversation
What about
before.
Lord?
Lord, yes. Now, let me start by saying that it's very rare that we have a guest on Skeptics in the Pub who invents a new word for the English language. And we have, courtesy of you, Vesha.
Yes.
Vesha,
yeah.
I like this word. We'll find a use for it. Vesha, I've written it down. I'm going to publish it in a book sometime. Vesha, invented by Dr. Professor Associate Lord Paul Willis. That's all right. Paul, I wonder if... Yeah, Professor Doctor. I wonder if you remember, Paul, your talk brought back memories of one of the very first times we met, which was in Adelaide in the year 1999, where you were a guest speaker at the Australian Skeptics National Convention that year. And I believe, if my memory serves, you were speaking about how to use the media to your advantage, sort of like media training. But also at that convention, another speaker gave a talk called, from memory, The Purple Economy. And I hope you bought a beer for me too. The Purple Economy, which, if you remember, was all about how the churches use the tax system to their advantage.
Yeah, I was trying to track down the Purple Economy Watch, and I was trying to track them down in writing this speech and on several other occasions subsequent. And they seem to have disappeared from the landscape a couple of years after that convention.
Okay.
But they unearthed some really interesting questions, such as, if I remember rightly, and this is back in 1999.
Yes.
One of the, I think it was the Russian Orthodox Church, was able to import $10,000 worth of Russian cigarettes into Australia tax-free. The Catholic Church in Adelaide actually owned the building that the Adelaide head office for the ATO, the Australian Taxation Office, was housed. And the Anglican Church in Sydney was doing so much trade on the stock market that it was cheaper for them to buy their own brokerage than to pay brokerage fees. Now, these allegations, as I said, they were all made back in 1999. I suspect that it's probably a similar situation. And if I remember rightly, in 1999, the Purple Economy Watch said that there are 10,000 organisations listed as religious organisations for tax purposes in Australia, and that is now 19,500 organisations. So God knows what they're getting away with.
God knows. A church importing cigarettes, you know what they call that? Holy smoke.
Yeah.
Okay.
Keep working on that act. I'm sure you'll get there one day.
I tried. We have greetings all the way from a viewer in Atlanta, Georgia, Dr. Angie Mackey, who was also a guest speaker at Sydney Skeptics in the Pub one year. Dr. Angie, great that you're tuning in all the way from the other side of the planet. We've had lots of questions come in, Paul. let's have a look at some of the questions that have come in. What are your thoughts on chaplains in public schools? I bet I can guess.
Get them out. Waste of money. It is so heavily. I mean, what are they doing there? If the role is to provide support for students, then surely you should have trained counsellors, not religious chaplains in schools. I'm all for having trained counsellors in schools, but situations like, okay, so the chaplains are supposed to be providing support for pupils at the school. Take the case of my son. He's gay. What sort of advice is he going to get if he goes to a chaplain for support? And it's unlikely that they're going to get the kind of level-headed and open-minded acceptance of his condition and support for condition. Sorry, but his
state of being. Yes, we know what you mean. Yes, yeah.
So they're not fit for purpose. It's just simply a racket that was set up to appeal to the Christian voters of Australia, and it's what, $250 million poorly spent.
Right. Next question coming in. What are your thoughts on Satanism? And let me add a little joiner to that question and maybe get your comments too. We've seen on the internet from town hall meetings in the United States where the Satanists have been given the right to give the invocation, and the Christians are going bananas, screaming abuse and doing all sorts of things.
Well, as a secularist, if they want to espouse those beliefs, then the first rule of secularism is that the religious freedom and the respect of anyone's religious beliefs, and so knock themselves out. They can do all the Satanism that they want to, and no one should be able to stop them.
The hell you say?
Well,
I'm trying. I keep trying. I do keep trying.
Yeah. You're very trying. Very trying. Yes.
I am very trying. Let's have another look at another question. What is your view on the religious question in the census? I think we probably covered the census one too. But let me add something else. I think I saw something in the press even today warning people not to put Jedi, because I guess the government would think that was just a made-up religion. But it prompts the question: a made-up religion?
Well, yeah, but the point is that if you put something like Jedi or the great spaghetti monster or something like that, you might think it's a bit of fun, but really you're doing a disservice to yourself and to your society. If you don't have a religion, then simply say not religious, because if you dilute that vote, if you dilute that quantum of non-religious people in the country, then what you're doing is you're artificially inflating the religious vote, and that then has ongoing problems with how money is divvied up by the government for various things, such as religious schools. It was interesting, as I said in the talk, it's literally only today that the National Secular Lobby have released their polling and their surveys around the religious question in the census. And while I was, because I was the nominated ambassador for that press release, so I've been doing a few presses about it today. I did my homework and sort of surfed around the net a bit to get some different opinions. And there's actually the Christian School Society of Australia actually have a web page saying don't put no religion on the census because it will affect their funding.
Right.
So
Yeah.
there's a lot more at stake here than having a bit of fun. So
Yes.
As tempted as you might be to put down Jedi Master or the Great Spaghetti Monster or something like that and have a bit of fun with the census, please resist that temptation, behave yourself, and simply state that you have no religion.
All right. Good advice indeed. And if anybody wants to see some really bad jokes, they're happening on Twitch at the moment, courtesy of that goose Maynard. Thank you very much, Maynard. Another question.
Really bad jokes from Maynard. That's an oxymoron.
That's I know it's this. Now a question sort of bouncing off the one about the census, and I think you put up a slide where it said other religions could include blah 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 atheism.
Yep.
How tied do you think it is in the public imagination, the broad public, that atheism is a belief system just like a religion?
Yeah, that's the absurdity of it. And it's another reason why I'm backing away from atheism as an argument and as a concept. Because, when you look at the new atheist movement, that will seem to have fallen off of that in recent years. Yeah. But, they really did go around putting themselves up as an alternative to religions in an almost evangelical way.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, I'm trying to view it from the position of the interested layperson. And I'm not sure that most lay people would not understand that atheism isn't a religion, which it clearly isn't. Yeah, atheism is the antithesis of a religion. And so, to have it listed in the census as another form of religion, that can only cause confusion. I agree. Again, when you get to that part of the census, folks, you might see that it says you can put down atheism as another religion. Don't do it. Put in no religion. Tick the box, no religion.
One wonders about the author of that particular question and whether it was vetted or passed through a committee or what. Yeah,
one does wonder.
One does wonder. And speaking of that sort of, in that vein, we have another question here from Phil who asks, how do we get rational humanists into the Australian Parliament? We need to change and quickly.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. The only known atheist in the current federal cabinet is Simon Birmingham. And when you look at those figures, where from the last census, it was something like 36% of Australians identified as not religious, and less than 2% identified as Pentecostal, and yet in the federal cabinet, 11% are Pentecostal, and less than 5%, because of Simon Birmingham, are non-believers or atheists. So that disproportionate representation, I don't know how you combat it. I think we just need to put up more secular and non-religious candidates. Do remember that we did have a secular, non-religious, atheist prime minister in Julia Gillard. So it's not quite as bad as the United States, where as soon as you profess your atheism, that's the end of your political career. There is life for non-belief in politics in Australia. We just need to fan those flames.
Yes, I agree, and I think the comment's been made before that there must be a certain percentage of politicians in the United States who are atheists, but they dare not speak its name.
Yeah.
I think I've got time for one or two more. Let me have a little scan down.
I did see a question
Yes.
come up in the stream there.
Yes, please.
So someone said, "What's an oxymoron?" It's someone who doesn't know how to weld with gas. Carry on.
Don't give up your day job, Paul. It's quite all right. Somebody asks, what do you think about converting just before you die, just in case?
Well, what are you going to convert to?
That's right.
And how do you know you're going to make the right choice?
Yes.
You know,
right.
that's my problem with that argument. It's a really quite a silly question, really. No offense to whoever asked it, because it assumes that you know all along that they're right.
Yeah.
And
it's done out of fear. You do it out of fear, wouldn't you?
Yeah. I know all along they're talking bollocks. Why is my opinion going to change on my deathbed?
Yeah, very good point. And let me round up. Thank you, everybody who was busy on the Twitter, not the Twitter stream, the Twitch stream, sorry, and on Slido asking questions. What a fascinating subject it is. And let me wind up, Paul, just briefly and say certainly one of the happiest days and little periods of my life, it happened about 6 years ago when I visited Adelaide with James the Amazing Randi, and we kicked off James Randi's tour of Australia, where I had the unbelievable honor and pleasure of interviewing James Randi on stage. And there's a wonderful photograph of you and I and Randi all dressed up backstage waiting for the event to start, and those moments are just, you can't buy that. That's just priceless.
Yeah, that was at the Science Exchange, the Royal Institution of Australia. Yeah, no, that was a terrific night and a terrific man. Yeah,
and he's been gone almost a year now, so we do remember Randi, and you and I especially have those magical memories of interacting and being with the man, and in a very meaningful way. Paul Willis, Associate Dr. Hare, everything, Professor Lord Paul Willis. Thank you very much. Now, folks,
can I let me just stick up this end slide again,
you can,
because that is my Facebook page, my Twitter handle, and on Instagram. So if you've got any further questions from tonight and you want to get in contact with me, that's probably the best way to do it.
That's good. And don't forget, folks, Paul has wonderful series of videos about dinosaur news and dinosaur information, endlessly fascinating, especially when it comes to Australian dinosaurs, which I particularly love, Muttaburrasaurus and the gang.
Muttaburrasaurus. When will you
Muttaburra.
get it right? You've been mispronouncing Muttaburrasaurus since last millennium.
Since it was around, in fact. That's how long I've been getting that wrong. Paul Willis, thank you very much.
Been my pleasure.
Oh, and there you go.